Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones, joined by James Copley and Phil Smith. Lads, pleasure to see you. Pleasure to be on for the first time, to be hosting for the first time. Very exciting times. I mean, first and foremost, I've got to ask, how was the trip to Bradford at the weekend? Looked like a lovely day for a game of football.
It was canny actually. It was by far the best game of pre-season, which I suppose you would expect given the standard of opposition. And I think we were both quite pleased by what we saw from a Sunderland perspective. Like, it was really nice to see that, rather than just kind of like sit off and use it almost as like a defending exercise, Sunderland were actually really aggressive. I think it was probably the first time, like over 90 minutes, that you've actually seen what Lebris has kind of talked about in full. And like, obviously there's been a lot of noise about we want to get back to being like good to watch and all that. And it was probably the first time that you've seen that over like 90 minutes. So obviously there were times when they got picked off and stuff. But it was canny. I think after a very, very unenjoyable trip to Bradford on Tuesday, it was quite an enjoyable trip the second time around.
Yeah, welcome, Jason. Good to have you with us. I've thoroughly enjoyed Saturday, actually, as Phil mentioned. Thought it was the first time, because there's been a lot of talk, hasn't there, about an attack-minded style and a high press. And there was the first time where I was watching and I thought, right, okay, I get it now. I get what Lebris is trying to implement. Obviously, that was more of what we'd expect of the first team in terms of personnel compared to Bradford City the week previous. So I came away fairly encouraged. I think the point that me and Phil maybe made afterwards was that Will Marseille play the same way as Cardiff City on Saturday? Probably not. And there might be a few more long balls in the Championship over the course of the season that Sunderland will have to deal with. But yeah, I was really encouraged, with the caveat that we probably need a striker still as well, which is something we've talked about on this podcast for a rather long time now.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it a lot today as well. I mean, it's kind of understandable, isn't it, really, Phil? 5 or 6 weeks since Reg Lebris came in, he's obviously, got this much heralded tactical approach that he's trying to implement at Sunderland. It was always going to take a little while for him to get going, perhaps for the players to fully understand what he's asking of them. And I mean, obviously, we've still got a long way to go with that. But do you think that the performance on Saturday was the most promising signs we've seen from Sunderland under Lebris?
Yeah, I think so. They played pretty well against Forest, which is obviously like a similar sort of starting 11 as well. But that was a tougher game to watch because it was knocking on a door of 40 degrees. And obviously it was a lot earlier in the sort of pre-season programme as well. So I think Saturday, to be fair, was the one that felt most like an actual football match rather than, a training exercise, which you're used to. So I think what was nice about the game, or what was encouraging about the game for me, was that Sunderland created loads of chances. Some of that was through nicking the ball off Marseille. Some of it was just through some nice general sort of build-up play of their own. It wasn't all about Jack Clarke. Actually, Clarke didn't do a great deal until he hit the post about midway through the second half. Most of what Sunderland were doing was coming through Patrick Roberts on the right, which I think was like really exciting for everyone because like everyone loves Patrick Roberts. He's everyone's favourite player, and rightly so. And, last season, I mean, a lot was made of last season. I think, to be fair, he had injury issues, and we've seen it happen to so many players where they struggle to find their rhythm coming back. But like, that was something that gave me a lot of encouragement going away from it, because whether Clarke's here or not, Sunderland need other players in other parts of the pitch to be damaging the opposition. So yeah, I think there's a lot of positives. I feel quite reassured that Sunderland are going into the season with a fairly settled team, which has got a lot of quality in it. Where does it sit in terms of what's going to happen over the season? There's obviously still some big question marks, and the Clarke thing and the striker thing sort of looms large, doesn't it? And it will do until the window shuts. But so yeah, I'm a bit reassured. I feel like things are headed in the right direction, but you never quite know. And Cardiff aren't going to play like Marseille, so that's going to be a very different challenge and a very different style of game. So I guess we can't read too much into that one off the back of Saturday.
I mean, you mentioned Paddy Roberts there, obviously a lot of people's man of the match on Saturday. James, any other real sort of standout performance for you at the weekend? Anybody really making the case that they have to be in that starting 11 come Saturday lunchtime against Cardiff?
I think he would have been anyway, but I thought Luke O'Nien was outstanding, actually. I know Sunderland shipped 2 goals, but I thought he made a couple of crucial blocks, a couple of crucial clearances. Read the game really well. I've been impressed over a large amount of time about how well Luke O'Nien has actually adapted to that centre-back role, and his reading of the game, I think, has improved tenfold as well. That's not to say that sometimes he isn't liable to be a little bit rash or get caught out at times, because I think he definitely still has that in his locker. But generally, I think he's improved. I think him and Elise going into the championship season is a good, solid partnership. Although a little bit of a concern that they haven't played together as much as O'Nien and Ballard, and I think any team in the championship would miss Dan Ballard. But in terms of the other players, Romain Mundle obviously didn't have enough time to sort of really impress as he did away at Bradford City, but he's been really good for me so far. But the problem he's got is that he's playing behind Jack Clark in the pecking order. So I think it's exciting that he's now an option for 20 minutes off the bench. But yeah, I think generally, that sort of starting 11 for Cardiff is more or less locked in. I think the question would be whether Sunderland would sign a striker before that. But even if they did, I don't think he would be ready. So barring any touchwood last minute injuries in training, I think the team that started against Marseille will likely be the team that starts against Cardiff.
One man who was in attendance on Saturday, obviously didn't feature, wasn't in the squad, Ian Poveda, Phil. I mean, do we have any sort of clue as to how close he is to potentially making that Sunderland debut at this point?
Yeah, not particularly. Lebris doesn't give a huge amount away on these sort of things. Kind of guy who is very, very happy to tell you about his formation and tactical details and stuff, and very, very guarded with other things. But he did say, listen, he said he didn't know when Poveda would be available, but that they're being very cautious with him. So I think we can infer that he's not going to play a significant part at Cardiff this weekend, judging by the fact that he's not had any minutes whatsoever. I'm not even convinced we'll see him on the bench, although I suppose we might do. I think it's pretty clear that obviously he has had injury issues in the past, and also he did miss the end of last season. So it's not just as if he's come in late during pre-season. He's actually even further behind because, he wasn't playing towards the end of last season. So I think that's going to be a bit of a long-term process. I mean, you would see that Preston game. Could that ideally be the chance for him to get half an hour off the bench to start that process? I imagine that would be the ideal scenario, but I don't see him playing a significant part this week. And I think there's an argument that I'd be surprised if he's in the squad, given that you've got Barr as well, who has now made a couple of appearances. So that's definitely going to be a bit of a long-term one. Maybe the fact that Roberts is playing so well at the moment allows them to be a little bit more patient. I think that's the position he's primarily going to play in. Yeah, maybe what Roberts is doing at the moment allows them to take things slowly with Poveda. But it definitely, I get the impression that he's going to be sort of brought into the team pretty steadily. I don't see him playing a huge amount in these first few weeks of the season.
I mean, let's properly look ahead to Saturday then, that Cardiff game. And I know you're saying there, James, that you think Sunderland's lineup is pretty settled, that Reg Lebris sort of knows what he's wanting to do and the personnel who will fulfil that. But are there perhaps a couple of positions where he still has slight decisions to make? If you look at the centre of midfield, perhaps, when you look at the likes of Chris Rigg knocking on the door, obviously Alan Brown's been playing in pre-season. Adil Ashish has had a pretty decent pre-season as well, and you look at Joe Bellingham. I mean, do you think that those are decisions that Lebris will be considering, or do you think that he is pretty much there when it comes to that midfield area?
I think he is pretty much there now. I do agree in what you're saying, though. I think Chris Rigg made a really, really strong case earlier in pre-season to be starting the Cardiff City game, and we said on the Whistle video, which we record afterwards, that I think Alan Brown's slightly moved ahead of him now, not necessarily because Chris Rigg's done anything wrong at all. I think he's actually been really good, but it's just Alan Brown's got that experience, he's got that know-how. We mentioned before, when Hume goes forward, he'll drop in to right back. He's just so experienced, he's so good on the ball, he's very athletic, very box-to-box, brings a lot of energy, complements Dan Neil really well. So although I don't think Chris Rigg's done a lot wrong, and he can really count himself a bit unlucky, and I wouldn't be surprised if he feels a bit hard done to. But he's got the sort of mentality where he'll be absolutely chomping at the bit to bounce back and to get any opportunity he can. He's stayed at Sunderland, Chris Rigg, to play games, so I've no doubt that he will play games this season, absolutely, and he'll probably feature against Cardiff at some point, I would imagine. But I think Brown's just slightly moved ahead of him in the mind of Reg Lebris. I think the Joe Bellingham, Adil Ashish one is really interesting. Again, until quite recently during pre-season, I thought Ashish was perhaps slightly ahead of Job from what I'd seen in the performances. as he reminded us on his Instagram account recently, Adil Ushish, he's contributed with goals and assists during this pre-season campaign. But I thought against Marseille, we actually saw a Joe Bellingham who was getting closer to being back to his best. And it was a subtle reminder, I think, that actually Joe Bellingham is a really, really classy football player, and he possesses such athletic quality, such quality on the ball. He can pick a pass. When he breaks the lines, he's good. He's good at linking the play. So I thought that was an interesting reminder that he's, it's easy to forget with Joe, isn't it, the player that he is because of the age he is as well. We sort of take him for granted a little bit, and he probably did play a little bit too much last season. But I thought, yeah, he's moved ahead of Aushish again for me, similar to Brown over Riggs. So yeah, as I say, I can't see them being any sort of curveballs from Labrie. I think he's pretty much set his stall out in this last game against Marseille, but you never know, things can happen.
Absolutely. I mean, if nothing else, Phil, it's nice to be talking about a Sunderland team that appear, on paper at least, to have some decent options and the ability to rotate players in and out and maybe create different sorts of headaches for opposition teams.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the interesting things about this pre-season, just the season more generally, is obviously there's not actually been a huge amount of turnover in the team. Certainly not in terms of the starting 11. It's an interesting sort of question, isn't it? Is that, when the team finished 16th last season, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And I think you can see it both ways. Personally, I do kind of see it as a good thing. This is a team that halfway through last season was pushing for the playoffs. It was well positioned. It had some issues, as we know about, particularly up front, which haven't gone away, and that's concerning. But it's a team that we know is capable of competing with any team at this level. And I think that ultimately one of the big things at this window when we get to the end of it is I think we'll be pleased that Sunderland managed to hold on to a lot of these players. I know there's still a few weeks to go, but I don't envisage there being a fire sale. And I think that the team's in a decent place. For me, I think that that there's going to be 3 or 4 teams competing for the top 2, probably 3 of them who've come down from the Premier League. I don't see Sunderland being in that category. And then that there's going to be 10 teams scrapping for 2 playoff places, basically. And I think Sunderland are going to be in that category. I think they're good enough to be in that category. I think the team is settled enough to be in that category. And I think they've got enough quality. The question of whether they can be at the top of that pile, I think, depends on that extra little bit of firepower. And I think if you look back to when they snuck into 6th last time around, that was Ahmad, wasn't it? And it was to an extent when he was fit, Stewart. I know everyone says he was injured for so much of that season, but the point being, the games he played, he scored in every one of them. So I think that, that for me is the question mark. I'm fairly comfortable about this team. I think it'll be better than what finished last year. I don't have any huge fears about being stuck at the bottom end of the table. Is it good enough to get in the top 6? I think there's still a few big question marks there, and probably the depth is one of those.
I mean, we've already alluded to it a few times, so we might as well move on and talk about the striker situation, because it does feel as if it's all anybody is talking about at the moment around the club. Obviously, Elisa Mayenda has seemingly got the nod from Reg Labrie. He's started a couple of games in pre-season, looked fairly bright without necessarily scoring. But I mean, what have you seen from him in pre-season, James, to suggest that he might be the one who Labrie is putting the most faith in at this moment in time?
I really like him. I think he's improved a great deal from the early showings we saw of him at Sunderland. Obviously, he didn't play too much. I think he only started 1 game away at Plymouth, perhaps. And then he went on that surprising loan to Hibs, which was a little bit of a surprise because he was just starting to get sort of settled in the Northeast, and then he went up to Scotland. Didn't really happen from up there. I think he only played twice, and then he was playing with their under-21. So whilst I'm sure he benefited from it in terms of a little bit of experience, he probably would have been just better served maybe staying at Sunderland, getting the odd game off the bench and playing for our under-21s. So I think the way he's bounced back from that is good. He possesses some really good attributes. He's quite fast. He runs the channels. He's got a good shot on him. He did miss a good chance against Blackpool, which was saved. But Reg Labrie touched on this, Phil, after Marseille, didn't he? Is that he likes Mayenda. He's clearly a good player. He's clearly got something, but he's still young. He's 19. He's very raw. He's inexperienced in life and championship football. So Labrie's basically said we can't hang our hat on him for 46 games, and I think Phil would absolutely agree that whatever Sunderland do this summer will largely depend on whether they can get a couple of good strikers in and whether those strikers can hit the ground running and score some goals. Because whilst we have some really exciting attacking players, if Jack Clarke can reproduce similar numbers, that's a huge plus if he does stay. Patrick Roberts obviously had a little bit of a disappointing season last campaign in terms of his numbers. If he can get somewhere back to his best, that's fantastic. Then there's a little bit of depth on either wing with Mundle and Barr, but so much will depend on whether we can add 10, 15 goals from that central striker position. Will Mayenda be the player to get 15 goals in the Championship at 19, turning 20? I don't think so, despite being quite impressed with him during pre-season. I just don't think he's that player yet.
I think it's not like about a 30-goal striker either. Do you know what I mean? We are actually talking about getting 15 to 20 from, not just one striker either, like Mayenda, Rooston and whoever comes in. Clarke is a massive one, because I think if Clarke stays, you look across that sort of pitch, you can see Clarke finding 15 goals again. Absolutely no problem, the form that he's in. I think Joe will hit, if he plays regularly, I think Joe will hit double figures this season. I genuinely do. I think Saturday was the first time where you can really understand why Lebris has put him in that position, because when someone do press as high as they did at the weekend, then he's a nightmare for opposition defenders because of his athleticism, because of how his fitness. And I think that we saw last year he's got an eye for goal. And if Sunderland keep with this high press, I think he'll get in good positions. Didn't happen on Saturday, but it's pre-season, so I'm not concerned about that. So I can see Job chipping in with goals. So it's not about like a 30-goal. Obviously that would be nice, don't get me wrong, but it is talking about getting 15 to 20 goals from that group of strikers. But I do think that it's going to be very difficult for Sunderland to get into the top six without that. I don't think they're going to do it if you have the same kind of output that they had last season. And obviously the nightmare scenario is Clarke goes and you then don't get in those goals, because Mundle's been excellent all pre-season. Bradford, he was brilliant. I do think Sunderland have got a player there, but he's clearly not going to get, well, I shouldn't say that, you never know, but I don't think he's going to produce what Clarke did last season. It took Clarke a while to get up to that level, didn't it? And he had way more experience in senior football coming to Sunderland. So I do think it's absolutely vital. And the Clarke thing is still massive, I think. I still think that has an absolutely huge say in what happens in the final weeks of this window. Because, listen, if loads of money came in, that totally changes what someone can do up front. There may be players who at the moment wouldn't be within their financial means who would become so when that money comes in. That's not me saying I hope Clarke goes. I would much rather he stayed. But I do think that's kind of the key to everything at the moment. I think if Clarke stays, Sunderland is shopping in one market for a striker. And I think, the profile of player will be, they might have to take more of a risk. They won't be spending the kind of fees that some of the Championship clubs have spent on Kiefer Moore, for example. If Clarke goes, then maybe you're looking at some slightly different deals. So it's going to be a really interesting few weeks. I've said it for years, shut the transfer window before the season starts. It gets on my nerves every single year, because I just don't think it's right. I think when the season starts, everyone should have their squad. January I can understand, but yeah, that's a tangent. But we should shut the window a few days before the season starts. I'll say it every year. I'll be back next year to make that same point.
There's Phil's rant for the year done. Just on the back of the Clarke point though, it's really interesting the timing of that transfer. If it did happen, if it happens on deadline day, you almost feel, what's the point if Sunderland haven't already got their preferred striker target through the door? Because then suddenly the prices go up. You might not get a deal done. We've seen historically Sunderland not be able to get a striker deal done on deadline day, and Kiefer Moore in January. So the timing of that will be essential. If Clarke's going to go really late into the window, does that allow Sunderland enough time to get who they need in it? It's a balancing act, and I don't envy the decision makers, to be honest.
No, I think that's a really, really fair point, James, as well. Like, the last thing Sunderland want to be left with is, 20, 25 million pound burning a hole in their pocket at 10:59 on August the 30th. It's going to do them no good, is it? Obviously you're talking there, Phil, about Sunderland shopping in one market at the moment for a striker. There are names being thrown about. Perhaps the most recent one that's sort of garnering quite a lot of attention is that of Ike Ugbo, obviously formerly on loan at Sheffield Wednesday last season. Sheffield Wednesday are still very much in the hunt to sign him. Have you got any sort of idea where we stand with that? Are Sunderland serious contenders for that signature, do you think?
I think serious contenders is fair, but I don't see them as the front runners in that one. I think it's fairly obvious that Sheffield Wednesday, very, very keen to have him back. I think he would be very happy to go back to Sheffield Wednesday because it's a place where he's obviously settled, knows his teammates, he's had an impact, has a really good relationship with the head coach. So, like, my thing sitting here would be that I would expect at a certain point Sheffield Wednesday to get the deal done. I don't think they actually have an issue with the fee that Ugbo's club wants. I think it's about the payment structure, and you have to think that that kind of thing can probably be overcome. I suspect maybe news of Sunderland's interest has potentially leaked a little bit to see if Sheffield Wednesday will hurry along and get it done. We'll see on that one. What I would say is that I think from the conversations I've had, Sunderland have registered a fairly serious interest. And I think actually the player sees it as a potentially really good move. I think that ultimately what he's looking for is he wants a settled home now. He's at a stage of his career where he wants to play regularly. And I think the project of Sunderland is one that really appeals. But if you ask me, like, just my own personal instinct is that Sheffield Wednesday is always going to be the preferred option, I think. I think it just reflects the fact, really, that Sunderland, this has gone on longer than people would have liked, and they have to have other irons in the fire. And I think someone who's scored a lot of goals and has championship experience is someone that they kind of have to look at. But, you know, the Alexandra Mendy saga is just one of the strangest I think I've covered, to be honest, in sort of getting nearing on a decade now covering Sunderland. So I still think that one is obviously significant. You know, I think incredibly rare for a player to come out and say which club he wants to join. You know, Darren Bent did it famously, but we haven't had too many since. So you still think that there's got to be something that can happen there for someone to have been in talks this long suggests they don't see it as a deal that's impossible to do. You know, and I think the fact that he still wants it, part of me thinks that will still happen at some point over this window. And then I suppose the question becomes, do you need another one? Is it a case of if Clark goes that you then go and sort of invest further in the final third? I'm not sure. So there's loads of moving parts to it. I think the one thing I would say about Ugbo is I don't know where he'll end up, but I get the impression that we're at the end point with that. I think wherever that happens, I think we'll see it happen pretty quickly because I get the impression he wants it sorted before the season starts. So I don't think we'll be waiting around too long for a conclusion on that one. If I had to put my money on it, I'd put money on him going to Sheffield Wednesday, but Sunderland are definitely very much sort of seriously in that race.
I mean, you mentioned the Mendy statement there, obviously, over the weekend. I mean, like you say, Phil, it is quite unorthodox, isn't it, James? But it does feel as if he's nailed his colours to the mast, and he certainly wants out of Cayenne this summer.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the first statement was so bizarre that I don't think we actually ran it in the beginning because we were, is this real? Like, we were a bit confused by it, weren't we, Phil? But he seems to come out with a couple of other statements. It is a strange situation, and also very Sunderland as well to have identified this experienced striker that everybody's crying out for, that we're finally going to pay money for, and then seemingly it's Kylian Mbappe's takeover of a French second division team which is holding it up. It's just all very Sunderland. The Ugbo one, I think I would really like to see Sunderland get that one done. I know that Sheffield Wednesday are ahead in the race, and judging by Danny Roll's comments as well, he thinks that it's set up for a photo finish, but that Wednesday are slightly ahead. But there's a couple of points. Obviously, he played with Ekwa at Chelsea, so he knows him. He knows Ian Pervada, so I think he'd be a good fit. And he's so experienced as well now for the age that he is. I think he's 25, but he's played 224 senior games now. He's got a lot of experience in the Championship with Sheffield Wednesday, Cardiff on loan. He's been around different divisions as well. He's played in League One, played in League One. He's played in the Belgian Pro League. He looked really impressive last season when I did see him for Sheffield Wednesday. And I just think sometimes this comes down to, and I've mentioned it a couple of times now, are we prepared just to extend the budget a little bit to get that key striker in, which is something you have to do. I think everybody would agree that Kirill Dreyfus, Speakman, Stuart Harvey, everybody that makes the decisions has a responsibility to always get the best deal for something that they possibly can. And we've seen, especially during the Premier League years, this club throw away money unnecessarily on the wrong transfers. So I'm all about, due diligence and everything like that. But sometimes when it comes to key targets and key areas of the pitch, you do have to not overextend yourself, but perhaps extend yourself past where you initially wanted to go. Not by much, but just to get that one over the line. And I think it's so important now, and it's gone on for so long. I mean, when we had Ross Stewart, we were talking about getting a backup to him. When we had Ellis Sims, we were talking about maybe we need another striker, and it's progressed over 3 or 4 windows to the point where it's become a little bit of a running joke within the fan base now. The caveat to that is a lot of clubs in the Championship are looking for a striker as well. If you speak to other clubs and other fans of other clubs, they all want a striker as well. So I'm not saying it's really easy to do by any means, and I'm not saying it's as simple as just pay the money, but I do think there is an element whereby sometimes you do have to just reach down into your pocket a little bit more and pay that money, because it's potentially the missing piece of the jigsaw. As Phil mentioned earlier, a little bit of depth is needed as well. But if we can get a good striker that can add 10, 15 goals, I think it could put us in a really good position.
I mean, one thing that we've seen Sunderland do fairly frequently in recent transfer windows is go to that loan market. It's worked out better than others on occasions. Obviously, Mason Burstow didn't necessarily light up the Stadium of Light last season, but do you think that that's something they could perhaps look to do again, Phil? Maybe, a little later in the window, if they are still looking to add that depth, if they do want a second striker through the door, maybe see what options are out there on a temporary basis?
Yeah, I think so. I think the key is to not be over-reliant on it. I think we saw it to an extent with some last season with Ahmad, in that it just left a gap in the squad that was never realistically going to be filled. I think Middlesbrough is a great example as well. Middlesbrough obviously surged into the playoffs with the likes of Cameron Archer, Ryan Giles, and then they didn't make the playoffs last year because they started the season so slowly. And I think you speak to anyone around Middlesbrough, they'd say part of it was because they just had too many gaps in their team. And you've seen them really turn away from the loan market as a result to try and get their own players in. So I think that Sunderland will always look to bring their own players in first, which I absolutely agree with. And I think you're seeing at the moment that, they're very much trying to get their own players in before they look at the loan market. But I also think if you aren't in a position like Ipswich last year, and Ipswich did have Premier League loans, but if you aren't in a position where you can just sort of invest whatever money you like pretty much within reason, I think, and you're trying to go for promotion, I don't think you can afford to ignore the loan market. I just don't think you can, because I think it gives you an access to a quality of player that otherwise is just totally unattainable. And as I always say, we know that it's the Championship. So we know that in the middle of the table, there's going to be 10, 12 teams separated by a handful of points. And the team that gets into that 5th, 6th position is going to be the one who has the best luck with injuries and the one who has that little bit of stardust. So I don't think it's something that they can afford to ignore. In terms of the striker one, it's really difficult because, we've seen this a few times really. Players they're not really going to want to come in to be second choice. And that's a big issue really. But maybe it's one way you can add a little bit of star power in another position. And like I said, the one thing we have to say is why we would all say that, you need goals up front. You need goals from all over the pitch as well. And you don't have to be a striker, to score loads of goals. So that's another thing I would say as well. So, yeah, I definitely think the loan market is going to be important. I don't see something doing more than one or two. And I think that's absolutely right. But I definitely think it's something that you can't ignore. What they won't do is they won't bring in squad players on loan. They just won't do it because the squad's already big enough in it. There's already enough players who, can make an impact but aren't sort of locked into the team. I think there's a lot of players in that category in their squad. So I think they'll only do it if they get presented with something where they just think, this is too good to turn down.
Would you think, Phil, that those sort of slight links to Jefferson would probably be dead now? I know he can play through the middle or on the right, but after we've signed Pervader, that's probably one that's not going to happen now.
As in Dan Jefferson?
Yeah. There were some sort of light links.
No, I see it much more as a central striker, to be honest. I think I know he hasn't played hundreds of games and scored hundreds of goals, but I think we're talking about someone who actually has Premier League experience. Bournemouth have invested a chunk of money in him. Sheffield United would very much have kept him. He's only left because of, I think, the uncertainty around the takeovers there. So I see him in that category of first choice, to be honest, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. I don't see Jefferson coming into Sunderland to be maybe I'll get some games up front if I impress in training. I think he'll have, I wouldn't say the pick of the clubs. I think that's probably pushing it a little bit, but he will be looking for somewhere to go and play every week. So it's not something that I would rule out, a deal like that. I would just be surprised if Sunderland were able to go and invest in an experienced striker and loan someone of that stature in. I do sometimes think we're all guilty of, and I'm very guilty of, get 4 players in that position, 4 players in that position, 4 players in that position. But like the realities of like, it's just very difficult to keep a happy squad and a settled squad, I think, that way as well. So it's a really, really, really fine line. I think that's the one thing I would say. But yeah, my gut tells me that Jefferson will be going somewhere to like play every week. I think he'll have enough clubs for Bournemouth to be able to sort of demand that. Yeah, but there's a few players in that category, and we all know they won't move till the end of the window. Jay Stanfield's another one, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
And again, he will have the pick of 10, 12 championship clubs. And that means that Fulham will be able to send him to the place that makes the biggest contribution financially and also where they know he's going to play. So, yeah, really, really difficult to do. It's hard to sign strikers as it is. Like, there aren't loads around. That's why increasingly we're seeing people like Sammy Szmodics win the Golden Boot. Because, those old-fashioned sort of strikers, if you like, there just aren't many of them around. And so when you find one who can do a bit of everything, they cost an absolute fortune. Ross Stewart, I think, in some ways, Ross Stewart's as big an issue for Sunderland's recruitment because I think it can almost trick you that there's loads of Ross Stewarts out there. Actually, I think he's like this one just ridiculous deal that Sunderland somehow managed to do and unearth. I actually sometimes wonder if there's a danger that it can lead you to think like, oh, we'll just find another Ross Stewart. And actually, like, that ain't going to happen very often. I think it's something to think about a lot. I love Ross Stewart, but maybe ruin Sunderland strikers forever because we're always chasing the next Ross Stewart, and then we're just realistically it ain't going to happen very often.
So I think what you're saying, Phil, is we need to go to Lee Johnson and Brian McDermott and say, would you like scouting positions at Sunderland? I think that's what I took from that.
There is a binder somewhere of Brian McDermott strikers. We need to find that binder. That's what we need to do.
You've sort of alluded to it there, Phil, but Sunderland do have a fair few players on the books now. I mean, we've talked about incomings. Let's maybe just talk about potential outgoings as well. One name that continues to be brought up in that regard is Elliot Embleton. Interest from Blackpool, reports of interest from MK Dons as well. I mean, have you heard anything in terms of what his immediate future might hold on Wearside?
Yeah, I think, we asked Labrise after the game. He'd obviously been left out of the squad. And I said, is there a possibility that Elliot Embleton leaves? And Labrise said yes. And that was that. So that's a one-word answer, straight to the point. I think that it's a really tricky one with Embleton because I think at the moment it doesn't look like he's going to play regularly. I think obviously you have to acknowledge that it's going to take him a while to get up to full sharpness just because he hasn't played that much football for 18 months. And so I think from Sunderland's perspective, because there's a lot of competition for places, and the fact that he's in the last year of his contract means another loan doesn't really work out. From Embleton's perspective, he's in his mid-20s now. He's not a young player anymore. Does he want to sign a new contract, go out on loan, and then sort of go through it all again next summer? Or is it time for him to say, look, I've had my injury issues. I'm not going to play here. It's time for me just to go and play somewhere and find a new home, if you like. I get a little bit nervous about it just in the sense that me and James have talked about this a lot. Like, if you leave Embleton on the pitch for long enough, he will generally chip in with a goal or an assist. Takes risks. He can lose the ball. Defensively, obviously, there's better players around him there. But he's got real quality. And those players who actually make goal contributions, I think we've seen through Sunderland over the last 18 months, 2 years. There aren't too many of them around. So I would feel a sadness if he went, I think. And there's a part of me thinks a little bit like, oh, don't rush into it because that's someone who could actually really chip in at some point in a long championship season. But again, am I then going a little bit back to what I was talking about before, just like keep everyone, you never know. And like realistically, you can't do that. So I now think it's pretty likely Embleton will go on a permanent. I have a hunch that he will drop down the pyramid and then find his way back up really, really quickly. I think if he stays fit, I just think he'll be so clearly too good for League One or League Two level that you'll see him coming back up like super quickly. But yeah, I can see it. It's hard to be. I think how I would put it is, I don't know what James thinks. I think it's hard to criticize letting him go because I think there are so many like logical reasons for it. But it's one that I'll be disappointed when it happens. I just think it will be a shame if that makes sense.
I completely understand the arguments for Elliot Ambleton leaving the Sunderland. Obviously, he needs to play. He's been injured for so long. I think he's 3 years younger than Dan Neil, and Dan Neil's actually got a couple of more senior appearances than him across his career, which sort of tells you everything you need to know about Elliot Ambleton's injury record. I think where I sort of get almost a little bit annoyed, really, is that, and don't get me wrong, I do understand the arguments for letting Elliot Ambleton leave, but for me, it's the sort of, we're just going to cast away this player who's actually contributed for us, who's come through the academy, who has got quality. I think we're maybe being a little bit dismissive and sort of not putting perhaps enough respect on his name in a way. And I think you get the feeling, don't you? You just wonder if whether it's because Sunderland have signed so many, young, exciting attacking midfielders / wingers. Job, Aushish probably well ahead of Embleton. Embleton could play off the left, but there's a very good couple of players there that he's not going to get a chance at Sunderland, and because he's not a player signed by this recruitment team that his future lies elsewhere, and he's not necessarily going to get that push that he did earlier in his career at Sunderland, which I think is a crying shame. Obviously, he scored that goal at Wembley. I think playing for Sunderland does mean a great deal for him and to him. So, yeah, I think a deal that makes sense, be good for his career, but one that I struggle to be happy about, really, just because of my feelings towards him. And I do think it is a crying shame when we cast players off maybe he's a little bit too soon. But then again, football is a brutal business, and I do understand the arguments for letting Elliot Ambleton go. It just does sting a little bit when you get this sort of heartless, like, just let him go, just get rid of him, he's no good. I do find that hard to palate, I really do.
And a few other names, potential loan exits, perhaps. I mean, we've talked a lot about the striker situation. It would appear that Louis Hamir is quite a way down the pecking order now. I mean, do you still see him at the Stadium of Light from the end of the transfer window, Phil?
No, I think Hamir will go. I think obviously he's not been involved in the last couple of sort of. He was on the bench at Bradford on Tuesday, but didn't come off the bench. I think Sunderland made it pretty clear that he's not going to be part of Labrisa's plans. The challenge with Hamir is where does he go? Because I think the dilemma you've got is obviously you want the key things that Hamir kind of struggled with last year. One, just incredibly, totally understandable, is obviously just the scale of the move. He's a young lad moving to a completely different country, different language, totally different city. That's obviously going to take time. And we know, because we heard 3 different head coaches talk about it, is that they really wanted him to improve his off-the-ball capacity, improve his running, improve his pressing. So it's quite difficult, because really both of those things, the best way to develop that is in-house, every day in training where you can work with him. The problem is that also, if you loan him out to the AFL, is he just going to run into the same issues he had at Sunderland, and do you potentially not really get anywhere? But if he goes, for example, back out to European League, where maybe he'll be a bit more comfortable with the playing style and maybe he'll get more minutes, are you actually then improving the things that you need him to improve for when he comes back to Sunderland? So I definitely think that I see Hamir going out on loan, but I think it's a really tricky one in terms of finding the right destination. And I actually think you saw that with Bennett, who's another one who'll go out on loan. I know he had an injury when he went out of Greece, which obviously didn't help, but that didn't seem like a great move. Again, Mienda, he's made good progress in pre-season, which is good. But that Hibs move was a strange one that really didn't work. So I think I see all of these players that we're talking about going out on loan. But what's going to be really interesting to see is what destinations actually picked for them and how someone get that balance between ensuring it's somewhere where they're going to play regularly and be in a position where they can progress, but also ensuring it's the right environment that will help them do better at Sunderland when they come back. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's a really interesting one, and I have no idea where Hamir will go, and I think that's going to be a really interesting decision for them to make.
And James, finally, just a word on Jay Matete as well. I mean, he also looks as if he could potentially be heading out somewhere, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I really like Jay Matete. I don't think it's necessarily going to work for him at Sunderland. I think he needs to go and play games. To be fair, it's a very, very good omen to have at a League One club, because I think he's won promotion in each of the last 3 seasons, once with Sunderland, with Plymouth Argyle, and with Oxford as well. So he's clearly got something. He's a good player. I don't think it's going to happen for him at Sunderland. To be brutally honest, I think there's just too many players that are ahead of him in that position. He's had some rotten luck with injuries. He was, he probably would have been needed at times during Sunderland's promotion to League One, and obviously there was a couple of times in the Championship as well where we thought we might need Jay Matete, but there was a couple of injuries and it never quite happened. So I think one of those where if you can get a little bit of a feedback for Jay Matete, I think that would be good business to League One, where he can go and play and he can go and develop. Still a relatively young player. He's only 23, so I think it would be one of those where it's just best for all involved, and wish him well. But a good player and a really nice guy by all accounts as well. But just one of those that hasn't quite worked out. It does happen in football.
Yeah, and is the feeling, do you reckon that probably will be a permanent one then, rather than a loan deal?
What do you reckon, Phil?
I'm not sure, actually. I think that Matete, I do think would probably be a loan, just because I think that I still think that because injuries have been such a significant part of why he's not been able to break through, I don't think Sunderland would be in a rush to sell him, because I think they probably feel like he's probably not at his full potential. So there's always a chance that with some regular football under his belt, he either grows his value a lot, or he might show that he's actually got the level to come back and compete at Sunderland. So I think their preference would be to loan him. What I would say is, I think if someone was to put the kind of money on the table where they recoup what they paid for him, then they would definitely consider it. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But if you're asking me now, my bet would be he goes out on loan. But I definitely think if someone come and put a good offer on the table, then I think they'd be open to a permanent as well.
Right then, I think that's very probably all we've got time for this week. Thanks to James, thanks to Phil, thanks to everybody watching and listening. The Raw will be back next week. It's available on all social media platforms. And as always, for everything Sunderland, keep up to date with the Sunderland Depot. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.